And I do occasionally still dabble when I have some time doing architecture and urban design on the side, because you can never let go. It's way too much fun. Um, so I want to talk for about, hopefully about a half an hour here today. Nathan and I kind of talked about, thinking about this as more of like an advanced 101 type session. I think there are a lot of things in here that will resonate with some of the familiar faces I see, and some of it that might seem very simple and basic to those of you who are very experienced, and then hopefully some of it will be new as well. I typically have a prelude to what I'm going to get into in terms of the meat, that is more sort of how we got here, or how I see it as, what are the forces that got us here. I'm gonna actually bypass most of that today, because I think for this audience, it's not as relevant. I'd like to jump into a little bit more of the meat. So I'm going to get started right here. Okay. So what I want to start talking about, is obviously the big story we all know about for the last couple of decades has been the rebirth of the walking and biking culture all over the US, and the rebirth in urban living. And it's not just a fun and interesting story, but it's a legitimate story. It's an important trend occurring in cities of all sizes, all over the country and all over the world. And I think it speaks to a lot of what, as humans, we like to experience. And there's a real human side to the story that I want to talk about today, that I think we don't hit on enough when we hit on these issues and talk about design issues and urban redevelopment, but really focusing on the human side of what matters. But while we focus on that success story, we kind of often don't get a full picture of what's really going on the ground in much of the country. And before we start talking about what might or might not work in terms of downtown redevelopment, in terms of any kind of urban redevelopment, I think it's also important to understand the picture of where we are, because your city or town could be in a very different situation than any other city or town. And we read about the success stories all the time. And there's about 6 or 8 cities in America that really get about 90% of the coverage when you read about cities and city living. And then there's like everywhere else. And everywhere else is very different. And some of everywhere else is doing really well and changing and growing and becoming more urban, and some of it is not. But part of the reality is that in many of our cities, we are still just barely recovering from decades of decline. So in my own city here in Kansas City, our urban core, you will actually read about us from time to time. You'll see stories about the cool things going on here. We've got this great new streetcar line, which is actually, one of the major things that I'm working on is the extension of the streetcar for 4 more miles through the heart of the city. It's phenomenal. We've got a lot of great momentum. But I like to remind people about, let's look at the historical trajectory of where we actually are. And this is important to have context about the problems that we have today and to try to prioritize. In our urban core, we have about half the population that we had at the peak in 1950. And in addition to that, our incomes in the urban core are substantially less than the regional average. And this is actually a very common pattern in much of the middle of the country and a lot of the Northeast, that despite what you might have read about the urban renaissance everywhere, the truth is most of the wealth is still in the outlying areas and the suburban areas. And most of the urban revitalization is still really very much in its infancy. And I have like one example here, which is Minneapolis. Minneapolis, you will often hear as one of the tremendous success stories in the middle of the country. And it is, it's a great city. They've seen a ton of improvement in the last few decades in a repopulation. But even in spite of all of that, they are still substantially less in population today than they were in 1950. And this is a common effort that we have to wrestle with, that there's a whole lot of our country that looks more like this than anything else. And we have a lot of small towns that experience the same kind of problems and issues. This is a small town in northern Missouri called Chillicothe, that I worked with several years ago. And you can kind of see from the aerial, it has sort of a classic courthouse square pattern. Well, you also see what has happened and the gradual deterioration and wasting away of that urban fabric. And this entire block just off the square, which was bought by a local bank and tore down the entire block and built a suburban style building perpendicular to the square. And if you think it looks bad in aerial map, it looks even worse on the ground. And this is I say all this so that we can kind of understand this is the reality of a lot of America, and there are people struggling at very different scales and places to figure out how to improve a lot of these communities. We have an awful lot of our city that looks much more like this than it does in terms of a thriving urban area. We have acres and acres of land that has been virtually abandoned. And that's common in many, many cities across the country. And what we have built instead in recent decades has almost entirely been in a suburban fashion, I think, as most of us know. And suburbia is really about building the ultimate private realm, which we did and we've done in our city very, very well. We have some exceptional suburbia in our area, and a lot of America does. And it's going to be around for a long time. Its desirability is I think fading gradually, but it's still in great demand for a lot of people, and it's what a lot of people just know in terms of what a lifestyle actually is. And so I mention all this to say the reality is that despite all of the work that we've done in the new urbanism, that this transition to a more urban lifestyle is still incredibly difficult for us as a society, as people, as humans, and we can't kind of ignore that or wish it away. There are a lot of places that are hurting, and many more, in fact, that are really thriving. And so change is difficult. It's going to be very hard for a lot of places in our country, and that's kind of the reality of where we are. Um, so I say that to say it's okay. I think we're going to be okay. I think we'll figure this out. Uh, but the reality is we're in an era of tremendous transition that is going to be very difficult for a lot of people. And I used to think, in many ways, this was all kind of a design problem. And I love design. I'm a designer. I think design's an incredible tool because it really helps people kind of cut through the BS in a lot of ways. You can say, well, is the answer A or B over here? But a good designer can say, well, actually, we can slice it through the middle, and there's this whole other thing that you didn't even really consider that will help solve a problem. And that's really the wonderful thing about design and building is you can test creative problem solving. But the reality is we have a human problem that we have to address and think about as part of all this. It's not just design issues. There are questions of human culture and thought that we have to really emphasize as we all do our work. So I like to remind us all that there is a human side to this equation that as designers, I wish we talked a little bit more about, the things that people actually find pleasure in and enjoy about our urban communities and about a more social approach to life. And we do find that there are more and more people who are turning towards a different approach to this. About 7 or 8 years ago, when I wrote the book Why I Walked, what I was most interested in was exploring this notion of what other people found interesting from their own perspective. What was it that they were finding valuable in their own lives about living differently than the norm in American cities? And so, we had a lot of people tell their own stories in that book about here's for me what it is that resonates. Is it something about riding a bike? Is it a human connection, a way of life in your community? And I say all this again to say that as we think about redevelopment and urban development of any kind, we cannot lose sight of the human element of this and the human touch, or else we simply won't be successful. So what I want to talk about first then in terms of thinking about how you might be successful in your own community. I'm kind of break this down here in two different aspects. One is this first aspect, which is what can regular people do? People who are not design professionals, like many of us are, people who are not planning professionals. What can regular people do? Because I have come to truly believe that unless we give normal people something to do and give them a sense of purpose, that none of our efforts will ever be truly successful or long lasting. That a lot of what we have to do is to unleash the swarm, really, of people and make it possible for many, many more hands to participate in our communities. And so I'll talk about that a little bit first. And some of these are things that as new urbanists, we know and we have done, and has been amplified pretty well. And I think it's important for us to continue to amplify these things. But embracing local action and entrepreneurship and incremental change is so important because it helps build community, and it helps build more desire on a greater group of people to push for change. If you might come into a position at some point in your life where you have a great leader in your community, maybe even a couple of great city staff people who can really help get things done. But the reality is administrations always change. And that change might happen 2 years from down the road or 4 years down the road or whatever it is. And you could go from really great leaders to lousy leaders pretty quickly. And I think most of us have experienced this. So if you don't have that well of bottom-up energy, pushing people, a real community that cares about what you're trying to do as a community, then it'll fizzle out. And so we've got to have those groups and that human effort to really push forward. So tactical urbanism projects like this, here's one we just completed last fall, where we were able to work with a grant from Bloomberg Foundation to remake a really awful intersection that's about 2 blocks outside my office here in Midtown Kansas City. A really horrible intersection for pedestrians where we're able to change it with the help of several different artists. And even in the midst of the COVID pandemic, still make a community event out of it and really help transform a place. And these little things that often seem little are incredibly important, not just for the outcome, but for the process of getting more people involved in caring. The same is true of, even temporary bike lanes or experiments with things like this. And I think as we think about ways that actual, like regular people outside of all of us weirdos in the new urbanism world, what can they do? Well, you know what? A lot of people really enjoy riding a bike. It's a lot of fun. But it's not a lot of fun in many of our cities because it's just very uncomfortable with the way a lot of our streets are designed. And the more opportunities we can have to help people get on bikes, to ride e-bikes, to do anything that gets you over the hump can make a huge difference in somebody's lifestyle. And I even like to connect with this guy, this Mr. Money Mustache, who some of you may know, who has this great quote that the bicycle is a wealth-producing fountain of youth. I mean, he just speaking about the benefits of bicycling from a personal standpoint, he has probably done more to get people riding a bike than any bike advocate that I know of, or group of bike advocates. But he speaks to the human element, of what makes it really great. Well, you get to get in shape a little bit and you save a lot of money doing these things. And it's really incredibly enjoyable. Once you get used to riding a bike again, you start to feel a little bit like a 12-year-old kid riding around the city. And that's a fun experience to have. And so I encourage us all to think about that. And then another area that I've had some experience with, I see my friend Brian Falk is on here today. We produced a document through the Lean Urbanism group that's about house hacking. So I like to joke that I was house hacking before I knew it was a cool term. And I think probably many new urbanists were as well. And that just really speaks to the notion of owning a property that has rental income attached to it. So what you see here is the back of the townhouse that we owned in Savannah when we lived in Savannah, Georgia. And we had an accessory dwelling unit on the back that was a 2-car garage with a really livable 1-bedroom apartment above it. And that 1-bedroom apartment in Savannah basically paid our mortgage. And that was an incredible benefit to us. That was a way for us to participate in urban living in a very different way. And I say all this element here again because the types of ways that we think about house hacking generally are they occur in places that are more urban communities, your downtowns, your downtown adjacent neighborhoods. And the more that we can amplify this and show people the human side of how this helps their lives, the more people you get enthusiastic about living in the kinds of urban communities that we talk about a lot and care about a lot. And then lastly, the more that you can just create events for people to get them involved. And we know so many of the design tactics that work really well to make great urban places. We all know about the value of street trees, for example, but getting people out to actually do those as a group is so valuable to build that sense of community, to get people to block off a parking lot and have a community dinner or a food truck day or something like that. These human elements and that side of it, the very personal side of it, I think a lot of us may think is tangential, but I think it's absolutely critical to having long-lasting success for any of the plans and efforts that we really care about. So the good thing that again, if I come back around to the good side of what's happened in the last 20 or 30 years, is we really have learned a lot. We really have seen markets improve in downtown areas in pretty amazing ways. This is a shot here in downtown Kansas City. We have new residential towers being built in downtown Kansas City that rent at prices that blow my mind. That, if you had asked me 25 years ago, would we see this happening? I would say maybe, it was possible, but really unlikely. And this is something that I think we're seeing now in mid-sized and larger cities all over the country. And so there has been this remarkable shift that really, if nothing else, has proved once and for all, there is a market for urban living. We used to question that to some degree, maybe 25 years ago. And we did well with a lot of our greenfield T&Ds, and we felt like we proved that there was a great market for walkable communities in greenfield sites. And we've seen now in many, many places that there is this great market for people to live in urban areas. But I think we have to figure out how to challenge ourselves to really take the next steps. And we should broaden our goals to make sure that what we're doing and that the change that's happening benefits as many people as possible and not just a few. So some of this is going to involve some different ways of looking at the problems that we have and different solutions. There are some very familiar techniques that I might mention here, but there are some other twists on things that I would like to challenge us all in terms of thinking differently about our cities and our downtowns. So I would start by saying, that change is here and in many cities, and it's going to come faster. I know we've had a rough year the last year. I think some cities have had a terribly rough year. And I wrote at some point, maybe 6 or 8 months ago, I wrote a piece about how I think we're going to see an unequal distribution in reaction to COVID. Some of the very large cities that get written about a lot are probably going to have some hard times for a little while and be slow to recover. But some of our mid-sized cities and others are probably going to prosper and do very well. And in a lot of places, you have people looking for urban living. Maybe they left to San Francisco, maybe they left to New York, but they're still looking for an urban living type of option in many cases. And so the urban market itself, I think, is going to continue to grow and steamroll forward. And what that means is we have to, for those of us who live in cities and have been experienced in cities for a while, we have to change from being kind of reactive and fearful of change to being proactive and hopeful, and doing as much as we can to accelerate the positive change. And so I try to encourage people to embrace what's going on as much as we possibly can. And this is a real challenge for many longtime residents of cities who are old enough to remember the bad old days and have experienced a lot of decline. But I think we do have a tremendous amount of hope for what can go on. I think the back to the city movement is absolutely real and will be long lasting. But we have a lot of places that are shifting now from low demand to high demand. And it challenges a lot of our thinking of how to change, how places should change. And one thing that I would emphasize is we need to find ways to let all of our neighborhoods grow and change again. And so I think new urbanists have probably been on the forefront of this for a while. But we had an era where we had a mentality to basically kind of lock everything in place and make it really difficult for even older neighborhoods and older places to change. And through a whole lot of well-intentioned approaches and people, we basically made it impossible to even build a humble duplex like is in this picture here. And we've gone decades without any normal gradual change. So people have forgotten what that even looks like or what it feels like to have normal gradual change in a city. So in a high demand world, if we try to make it really restrictive and difficult to develop, we actually amplify all of the problems that or the things that people might be fearing. So I think we have to get to a place here where we have to figure out, are we in our cities smart enough to learn from some of the mistakes in recent years? Or are we just going to kind of continue to copy what other cities have done and just copy and paste them around the country? And I'm not really sure what the answer is on that. Right now, the jury is out on whether we're able to do that. And it's incredible, how much change we used to be able to absorb very quickly. This is my great-great-grandfather, Klaus Klinkenberg. His wife was Klausina, believe it or not. No joke, Klaus and Klausina. When they left Holland in 1871 and it ended up in rural Kansas in 1875, you can see that there wasn't much around here. The population of Kansas City, Missouri at that point was less than 50,000 people. In order of just a few decades, look at the change that happened, for example, between 1890 and 1920. The city went from 132,000 to 320,000 people in 30 years. That amount of change is almost impossible for a lot of us to fathom today. And it was all done before we ever had planning commissions, before we had zoning codes, before we had parking regulations, before we had a lot of things that we really take for granted today. But we were able to accommodate immense change in a relatively short period of time. And we built places that look like this. We built literally every one of the neighborhoods in my city that people love the most and that refer to the most from a historic standpoint, we built in that era. And we built it not because we had 3 or 4 really big developers, but because we had lots and lots and lots of individuals and small developers who were building out the city. So what I would say first and foremost, if we want to think about what professionals can do, I have a series of 6 recommendations I'm going to run through that as professionals we can think about, whether you're a design professional, a planning professional, maybe if you were an elected official or just an active citizen. There are 6 things that I think we can really focus on. And the first is we need to radically simplify our zoning in many places in order to really unleash that swarm of people who can make change. So when we talk about all of the benefits of missing middle housing, and what I think we understand very well, whether we're talking about, houses or accessory dwelling units or duplexes or small mixed use buildings, or whatever they are, we have to think about who are the actual people that are going to build this housing. This is not going to be large development companies that build this housing. For the most part, it's going to be people like this. It's going to be that community of people that are like house flippers. The reason we have such an enormous house flipping industry in most cities in the country is because house flipping is basically frictionless. In many cases, you don't even need a permit to do it. We have an abundant supply of houses that anybody can buy And if you have the skills or the time or the hustle, you can renovate that house and sell it. Now, my contention is if we're ever going to have success with accommodating the kind of missing middle development we want to have, it's going to be those same types of people. It's local investors, small investors, do-it-yourself people, families, households doing it for themselves. And that's who we have to make it easy for. If we can't make it easy for the non-professionals to do this kind of work, it simply won't happen. And we end up in the situation where we are today, where we have a focus really on single family houses and then large apartment developments, and that's all we'll get. So we've got to find ways to radically simplify our zoning, at least for those types of products, so that people can easily do them themselves. The same is really true for a lot of our smaller commercial as well. So I like to tell this story. This was a little hot dog stand in a sort of a marginal neighborhood in Savannah, Georgia. And I would say, I think the typical middle-class person, when they drive by, if they were honest with themselves, they probably feel sorry for this person who's sitting out there selling hot dogs. And I think we look at that all wrong. I look at that, this is a person who is taking the first step on the economic ladder. They're doing what they can to sell something and make some money. And if they're successful, they might move up to do a space like this and have an actual small retail space of some kind that they could lease. And then if they're successful beyond that, maybe they'll own a small building. And the point of all that is, again, we've got to find ways to, in our downtowns, in our urban areas, to make it possible for those kinds of activities to happen and easy, because that's how people start on the ladder and that's how they build wealth. It's also, oh, by the way, how you build interesting local places that have lots of local character and not just filled with kind of the same old development. So a second feature that I think most of us know very well is we need to work very hard on remaking a lot of our streets. And the way I would caption this is we need to find ways to prioritize quality of life over commuting time. Many of our cities are still organized fundamentally around the idea of rush hour commuting. This is a street in my neighborhood where the outside lanes are still rush hour parking restricted in 2021, when the commuting patterns for these, when this street was set up, changed 40 years ago. The original commuting patterns from the 1960s or so were what drove a lot of these standards and ideas. So much of that has changed. And there's probably a good opening with what's happened with COVID over the last year, with commuting being down so dramatically, that there is simply no better time for us to rethink our street designs and reclaim public space for quality of life and better quality of life, whatever that is. In my case, in this street, it would simply be more permanent on-street parking. In other cases, it might be bike lanes. In other cases, it might be more pedestrian space. But we've got to find ways in all of our cities and downtowns to really begin to prioritize the quality of life in that place over the 9-to-5 commuters, basically the people who we've been planning for, who use those streets for about 10 hours per week. So there's 168 hours in a week. We have basically planned a lot of our cities for people who use those for only 10 of those hours. And that's a mistake that no place can ever be successful if that is the basis for its existence. We've got to change that calculus. A third way I think a lot of us can work on together is, planning and big picture planning takes a beating for a lot of reasons. Renderings like these are really easy to mock. A lot of times they're really bad and we can see bad ideas. But I think it's important, we have to have big dreams. It's okay for our cities to have big dreams and think about what we might be 20 or 30 years from now. It's a very human condition and notion. It appeals to our need to have big goals. George Bailey, wanted to build skyscrapers and he wanted to build big bridges. And, it's okay. It's good to want that. It doesn't mean it's all going to happen right away. but it gives people something aspirational to work towards if it's a compelling vision. So I think it's still critical that we have really smart long-term visions. And obviously, as an urbanist, I think they need to be guided in traditional principles that have worked well for thousands of years. But having those big visions is really important. Sometimes those big visions may actually not be huge. You know, this was an example. This is a fairly little used, basically a parking lot in Eau Claire, Wisconsin. And I used this example for an audience up there. This is at the end of a pedestrian and bike bridge, and it dumps out into the downtown into a parking lot. And you know, there's no reason that that can't be transformed into a gorgeous public space, you know, like this. So you already have this pedestrian amenity. Why not enhance that more and have a dream that that could be a beautiful public space? And you know, if there's one thing that most of our American cities still truly lack, it's great public space, and lots, you know, lots and lots of public space. Probably the single lesson I learned more from living in Savannah was just the absolute impact on having great public space on your daily quality of life. It really matters, and it is transformational in how people view a neighborhood or a city or a downtown. Sometimes a big dream, you know, might be more a little bit like this. You know, in my city, I put forward this notion of why don't we take this entire section of the urban core and say, you know, this is a low speed priority zone. It doesn't mean people can't drive here, but it means we are not going to prioritize fast traffic at all. And for a lot of people, that might seem to be an outlandish notion. Um, and I put forward saying, you know what, this whole area that seemed, which is quite large, it's actually only 8% of the land area of our whole city and less than 1% of the land area of our whole region. Is it possible we could make less than 1% of the land area of our whole region a sort of a paradise for people walking and biking and taking transit? That's not to say that people still can't drive and everything else, but they have to drive slowly when they come into this area. And so, you know, putting forth those big ideas, I think, is really important for people. I mean, we all know what Daniel Burnham said about this: make no little plans. I also think it's fun to reiterate what he said on page 2 of the Chicago plan, which was basically, okay, those plans also need to be practical. We need to be able to implement them, and that is true as well. It's important to have big dreams, but then also know what you can do the next week, the next month, and the next year so that they can be successful. I sometimes refer to that as the Casey Kasem School of Planning. Keep your feet on the ground, but keep reaching for the stars. So these things I think are important for us in our cities and our downtowns. A fourth item, you know, we've talked for years that there's like 3 legs of what we call community building. There's design, planning, and management. And we don't talk about management nearly enough. It is the most undervalued aspect of cities and downtowns and urban living in general. I would probably suggest that we have a crisis of really terrible city management in most of our cities. And it has a devastating impact on the ability to do anything really well. And that's in large part because the management is too big. It's not close enough to the people. It doesn't get feedback enough from people on the ground, and it's not responsive enough. It can't, when it is really good, it makes an enormous difference in the livability of a city and the ability for it to improve. So we talk about design a lot. I'm a designer by nature, and I think design is also undervalued. For the most part, we have way too many people sitting over here. There's like, I think 80% of really smart people talk about policy all the time, and that's all they care about, and they kind of ignore design and management. But I think from our standpoint, it would behoove us to really think about how the management of places makes an enormous difference in the livability of a community. So I've had some firsthand experience with that with these last couple of jobs that I've had. And, you know, just the ability for us as an organization to make a change on the ground pretty quickly and react quickly, people notice it and they really appreciate it. A fifth thing, obviously, is for us to do the math. This is critical for, especially if you're trying to make the case in your city, in your downtown, about why improvements are needed, why your place is valuable, why maybe it's getting shortchanged in terms of funding opportunities. So obviously, what Joe Minicozy and his firm have done is remarkable in terms of helping with the math. Here was an example. Again, we just took a look at several neighborhoods here in the Midtown area and looked at the value that they create and derive for our entire city. And we quickly found that even after 70 years of disinvestment in our city, we're kind of hit that curve where we're starting to go back up now. But even after all that decline and population loss, our typical neighborhoods in Midtown create 6 times more value for all of the taxing jurisdictions in our area than a typical neighborhood does in Kansas City, Missouri. That's pretty incredible. So when you start to look at your own city and try to communicate why these things might be valuable or why people should be paying attention to it, doing this math is so helpful. It's a great message that I found that virtually anyone will pay attention to. If there's anything that really gets the attention of lay people and elected officials, it's when you start talking about money. And this really does the trick. The last element I would add is that human pleasure is not a frill. That if we want people to love cities, to move to cities, to stay in cities, in downtowns, we have to actually look at the human side of things and what is it that people care about and love. And in many ways, I think we need to look at the best places, look for excellence, and strive to work towards excellence. I have this slide up here. This is the city of Haarlem in the Netherlands, Haarlem, which is by many standards a fairly typical Dutch city, and yet it has these remarkable streets and spaces that are just absolutely wonderful for people, and they're incredibly wonderful to congregate in, to socialize in. These should be our goals: is looking at the best places and trying to strive for them. So, this culture change is real, and I think there's a lot that is going to help it continue for a lot of years. But it's really that emotional side eventually that resonates with people. Chris Lineberger used to have a line that we spent trillions of dollars trying to save cities, but it was only when people made an emotional connection to historic neighborhoods that it all changed. And I think to a large degree, he's right about that the emotional connection that people made to great old architecture and buildings is what eventually drew people back to cities. Okay, so lastly, I would just say, I'm not suggesting, I'll never suggest that change is easy. Change is always hard. It's difficult, but I think if we look at our cities with fresh eyes and look at our own places with fresh eyes, we can be really surprised at what's possible. And I think it's important for us to understand the human dynamic and communicate that to people, that we have visions for what we aspire to be over time, but cities are very complex and they're always changing because humans are complex and always changing. We're born, we grow, we die. We're never perfect. We're never fixed in time. We're never simple. We're always evolving and complex. And I like to say that humans are messy, and sometimes they're messy like that. But I think having a more welcoming and permissive attitude towards change and embracing that change is not only helpful to solve a lot of the issues we have, but it also frankly makes life a lot more interesting and provides more opportunity for more people. So the world that a lot of people grew up with and familiar with in our country is over, and it's time for us to move on. And I think it's important for us to be proactive and hopeful. So don't live fast and die young. Live slow, die whenever. Accept walk-ins. and remember what it is that that we truly love about being in urban communities. You know, sitting in a square having a sandwich really is a lot better than sitting in your car eating a sandwich. You know, going for a walk after a meal really is better. And these human elements are incredibly important touchstones for people. So we can do these things and accept change more broadly because it provides that opportunity for all. We can provide great public space because it works for absolutely everyone. And we can understand the human side of change and what's happening and strive for excellence and push each other for excellence. And with that, I will wrap it up.
Great.
Thank you so much for your attention. I appreciate it. And I can see the chat now and see that there are some comments and questions.
Can you hear me, Kevin? Leslie can.
Leslie and Nathan, do you want me to jump in, or are you gonna?
I'm going to ask you some questions while other people may want to pose in the chat, some questions that Leslie can keep track of and she can jump in. But I've got two things. First, well, actually, first I want to say I had to eat lunch in my car today, overlooking a 6-lane arterial. So it was very unpleasant.
I'm sorry.
So I wish I had been on the square. But two questions. Number one is, you have experience doing greenfield work as well as infill work, and a lot of both. Do you see any difference from a design perspective that you have to worry about? And the other question was, how do you prevent bad design in a downtown setting? You know, that's a challenge because obviously there's all these individual owners, and cities, except in historic districts, really can't regulate the design too much. So if you have any pointers or ideas on how to prevent the bad design, that'd be interesting.
Well, it's interesting, Nathan. In a certain way, those are kind of related questions, you know, in my own mind anyway. You know, working in the greenfield sites was frankly easier in the projects that I've worked on because we often worked with new urbanist developers who wanted to do something on purpose. And we either wrote the code that created the ability for us to do the designs we wanted to, or we worked within somebody else's code that existed that basically was a code working towards an easier design process. Working in infill is much harder, frankly, just because of the process. The process is brutal in many places in trying to do infill because you have such bad zoning. Even in our city, we have terrible zoning in most of our infill areas, which leads to often having to negotiate every single little project. Even if I wanted to build a fourplex today in a neighborhood that has lots of fourplexes, chances are I'm going to have to get approval from at least 2 different public boards in order to do it. And so that makes the design aspect more challenging. And not because of the physical design of the building itself is any more challenging, but because of the process. So in a really wicked, awful way, that also helps us to try to make bad projects less bad. Because in a lot of our areas, we're in a state where every project is negotiated. We can actually weigh in and help correct some bad design flaws on certain projects. So that is not ideal. I don't think any of that is good. That's not the way the system I would like to have. But when you have an opportunity when projects have to go through a negotiated process, you certainly can impact the design and get a lot of change.
Other questions for Kevin, Frank?
I have a follow-up to that. Is that achievable by code or by design guidelines more? Is it more effectively achieved by code or by design guidelines and some sort of hand-holding? Because I think about the god-awful crap that would come out of just loosening everything without some, because we've lost the architectural culture that created all those lovely houses that we love.
Yeah.
Pictures of.
Yeah, you're right, Frank. I mean, and that is a real challenge. We don't have that building culture that we had 100 years ago. So if it were more permissive, you're going to get a lot of crap. And, but of course we get a lot of crap anyway, even with all the design requirements and everything we have. In our case, every city is different. And I can just speak for our case right now. We don't have a lot of design guidance in our codes. It's just that the codes are not written for urban neighborhoods. They're written with very suburban standards. And so that leads to a process where things have to be negotiated in order to get approved. So that gives you a little bit of an opening to talk design. But I would think in a perfect world, when I talk about sort of a radical simplification of zoning, I mean, I love our form-based codes, and I've written some, and I've worked with them, and I think they're obviously a far, far superior tool to any conventional zoning that we have. And I wish we had many more good form-based codes all over the country, but we don't right now. We have some, but we don't have a lot. I would love to figure out how we could get back to the 4-page Seaside code. And this ties into the conversation about management as well, because I think it's not just about what the standards are, it's about what the process is to get things done. And so many of you have been town architects, and you know that process, where you can actually have a fairly simple and light code if you've got a good town architect process in place, because you've got a trusted person that is capable, that can review those things, and you can have access to that person. They're very accessible. You can find them.
That's the handling process I was referring to.
Yeah, and you can work with them. I would love to see that more at a municipal level, where we could break down sort of the bureaucracy to where neighborhoods or districts were organized in that manner. So you could have a fairly simple code, but have an actual capable review person that you could work with.
That's let me. Are you done, Kevin?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I was going to say, Frank, to respond directly, I generally advise cities against doing it through the regulations and in favor of informal means. So when we were in Lafayette, that's why we went after Jeff Dyer to move there and start a development and design center. And that development and design center was set up to be a concierge for the development community, so that they would come before they even designed anything, because we provide the free conceptual advice. So Jeff would be able to sit down with him. That didn't cure everything, but that cured a lot more than a code ever could cure, is to be able to sit down at a table and have a talented designer explain things. And so we got the Economic Development Authority and a public trust to essentially fund the majority of that. And that was a successful way to preempt the bad design, as well as get, help people. So yeah, the code is a lousy way to get good design, because they're going to fight it, and it's political. Howard's got a question though. What's up, Howard?
Thanks. Hey, Kevin. I liked your slide or your point about when Kansas City got rich. Obviously, the 1920s, 1930s, and all of that era. San Diego, where I'm from, got rich in 1958, 1950, 61. And when your city gets rich, that kind of sets the tone, that sets the patterns, that sets so much. And in a great city, of course, like a San Francisco or New York, got rich multiple times, and therefore it has, multiple to it. Where like a Venice got rich all at once and it got stuck under glass, things like that. But I think that point is very good about understanding how to continue to build in that city. And when you try to radically change from that moment that set the tone or set it, it creates tension, and it creates problems, because you're not getting rich. And then if you're trying to do something completely different, you're taking away from your greatest moment or value. That's not a question.
Yeah, okay, good. I didn't know how you wanted me to respond to that.
Well, you already serenaded us, Howard, at the beginning of this. So
yeah, that's what I heard. That's why I popped in. I wanted to see what the heck was going on around here.
It's good to be lucky when you're a city, and there are a lot of American cities that had the good fortune to have their big growth periods in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. And so they have remarkable architecture and urbanism as a result. But yeah, if your big growth period was post-World War II, not so much.
Right.
Other questions? Anybody raising their hand? Mr. Muzan. You got to unmute, Steve.
Well, I thought I was, okay, so here we go. Yeah, no, I'm just going to say that I've been tweet casting Kevin's presentation. If anybody wants to find it, you can either look up Kevin on Twitter where his username is attached, or me, the one. So anyhow, it's out there.
Thank you, Steve. By the way, you know, I know in dealing with some designers, they're sort of surprised when somebody like Kevin with some experience starts talking about the non-design issues, because the wicked problem is clearly the humans, and they're in the way. And the thing that I didn't know early on in tactical urbanism was how critical tactical urbanism, incremental urban, all that stuff, all the small scale stuff was getting the humans to build relationships with one another who actually cared about the city. So I love, Kevin, the fact that you're bringing up what can we get regular folks to do, the non-professionals, because what it seems to me, what I equated it to once I saw it happening was that people were like almost exercising muscles that they had never exercised before. And that's a critical component to making it all work. So I'm glad you emphasized that. Other questions? Anybody want to pose something? Steve?
I'll throw in one more. Kevin, one thing you mentioned that I wish I'd have heard you speak more of, and that is the fostering of local entrepreneurship and the building of economy, because that could be a presentation all into itself. And I was delighted to chart that course from just a single crew workplace as the tiniest possible starting point to, progressively larger places. So thank you for that. And if you ever want to do one on that as a whole presentation, I think that we'd all be well served to hear what you have to think.
Yeah, and I've seen some of your writings on that, and I agree. I think it's something that we kind of unintentionally made very, very difficult through not just zoning, but a whole lot of other regulations, and to the great detriment of society. It really hurts the wealth gap. We've got to find ways to make it easy for people to get started doing things. And I think one of the good things has been, the rise of co-working spaces have really helped with all that. And some of those are kind of a modern workaround. But we need a lot more of sort of the informal approaches as well that really help people get started.
Great. Any other questions? If not, thank you, Kevin. Leslie, you want to wrap it up? Oh, yeah. Leslie, you want to say any final words?
Sure. Yes, thank you. It's a pleasure to be with all of you. I think, sorry, I seem to have some feedback. Is that okay?
There you go.
Is that better? Okay. The pickle in stereo sound. Sorry. The Live at the Guild, we envision these as being presentations and connecting with one another and sharing these thoughts. So I'm grateful to all of you for, staying here with us and asking questions, because it's this strong peer network that we want to build and continue to foster, which is the reason for Live at the Guild. So I just want to say thank you all and look forward for more of these to come. And we appreciate your active participation. And thanks again to Kevin for his time today as well.
Thank you all.
Thanks again, Kevin.
All right. Have a good week.
See y'all later.